Welcome back to the Day of Wellbeing. So today I want to talk about selfishness and whether it is a virtue or a vice or neither, or whether it maybe depends on context. Before I get into that, I just want to say I've just been swimming. And for anyone that's kind of following my personal journey, I went swimming last week. I did 10 laps. And for the next 2 days, I was completely buggered. It was a really stupid thing to do, except that I needed to run the experiment to find out where my line was in terms of post-exertional malaise, in terms of physical exertion. Clearly 10 lengths was too much. So today I went back and I did 2 lengths, right? So this is quite interesting, like applying the exact opposite of the crush it mentality. It's like staying so radically within my capacity that maybe my capacity will grow. I really hope that it does. It's an ongoing experiment. So that's just a little personal aside. But yeah, the main topic is selfishness, right? So it's a really interesting concept because often it's used in a very negative sense. However, there's kind of like a scale, I think. Okay, so on one end of the scale, I think a lot of people need to learn to be a lot more selfish. Okay, because there's this whole thing, in terms of self-care. It's like a lot of people, they feel it's their responsibility to look after other people's needs, and they put themselves second. And in terms of burnout and health and self-care, that's not very sustainable as a kind of lifestyle, especially if it goes on for years, like decades, like always putting other people's needs before your own. It can often end up in sickness as a kind of almost inevitable consequence of neglecting our needs. So that can happen. And so for a lot of people, the whole kind of people pleaser thing is like learning to say no, learning to say, actually, no, my needs really matter. I'm going to prioritize them, whatever they are. That can be a really important lesson to learn. And so, the one end of the spectrum is we're not nearly selfish enough. And it's a whole learning to kind of decondition ourselves, depending on our culture, depending maybe like gender issues or whatever, all sorts of different things that play into it, about what makes us predisposed to kind of put ourselves second, third, fourth, fifth, last, at eventually great cost to our own well-being, which ironically, paradoxically, can then mean that we can't benefit others. So this is almost like there's a book called The Selfish Gene that I haven't read, and I probably shouldn't say much about it because I know nothing about it. But this idea of, I think it's about enlightened self-interest, in the sense that actually by taking care of ourselves, it makes us better able to help others. Okay, and there's various images, like there's one tradition that talks about if you're an ambulance. That's a Buddhist tradition with a modern analogy. If you're an ambulance and your tires are flat and you've got no fuel and you've got no equipment and you want to go out and help people, it's not going to happen, right? So another one is the aeroplane. So oxygen mask comes down, there's a breach in the hull or whatever, and the advice is always put on your mask first, because if you try and put it on your children and you pass out, your children aren't going to be able to do it and they're not going to make it, right? So there's lots of situations or lots of useful analogies where putting yourself first is actually a virtue. Selfishness is a virtue, right? So this kind of very negative sense that we have of it in our culture, it's like you should be a good person, it's kind of Christian, Puritan, whatever, moralistic, be a good person, but do it because you should, not because it's like a natural wellspring of compassion and giving because you're, feeling so well resourced and it's just flowing over. That's a different thing. So this kind of obligation, moralistic, judgmental, be a good person. Not necessarily a very good motivation, and not necessarily in everyone's best interest, including your own and the people that you're ostensibly helping. So, some people need to be more selfish. I think that's the first part of what I want to say. But then we're moving along the spectrum, right? And we get to, well, let's go to the other end of the spectrum. So the Buddha says, I think it's the second noble truth, it says basically in some shape or form these words: the root of all suffering is self-grasping. All right. So like you could say that's another definition of selfishness, in a sense, or this kind of tight focus on our own reality, our own well-being, our own suffering, our own struggles, our own needs. Then it can become a source of suffering for ourselves and for others, right? Obviously for others, because we're like, we're not giving of ourselves, we're so focused on ourselves. And it can become pathological, like the kind of hungry ghost thing, or the kind of like ridiculously rich miser who could alleviate so many people's problems with their wealth, but somehow it's like, my money, me. Political parties tend to attract that sort of mentality, in my humble opinion. So what do we do about that? So less selfishness. So going back to Buddhism, one of the 6 parameters, which are like these, they're not moral guidelines, they're kind of like guidelines for good living, right? And one of them is generosity. So practicing generosity is a really good antidote to kind of too much self-grasping. And they talk about generosity of body, speech, and mind. So generosity of body would be like giving to charity with money, or giving your time to work for a charity, giving your stuff away. Kind of material giving is what generosity of the body is. And then generosity of speech, which is kindness. And so kindness in our words. And sometimes that can be the absence of words. It can be giving people our silence, giving people our undivided listening attention, generosity of the speech. And again, depending on who you ask, speech is like, in some traditions, like the Bon tradition, speech is, when they talk about speech, they're not just talking about physical talking, they're basically talking about energy, right? So I'm not particularly well up on this, but I'm aware that it's more than just your physical speech. So they use energy to basically refer to qi, what they would call in China, they're called qi, right? So they're talking about generosity of your energy, which I know overlaps with generosity of your body. So, these aren't kind of clear-cut distinctions. It's just a useful kind of model to kind of look at things. And then generosity of the mind, body, speech, and mind. So generosity of the mind, right? So this would be giving people the benefit of the doubt, interpreting things in the most generous way that you can. So someone does something that really pisses you off, it's like, well, maybe they're having a bad day. Or if someone behaves in a way that's really painful, trying to understand, rather than immediately going to the judgmental, they're a terrible person, judging them. And again, this needs to apply to ourselves, right? So we can't judge ourselves for being judgmental, but generosity of mind. So you're looking for the best. You're just, another word for this is magnanimousness. I never know whether it's magnanimosity or magnanimousness, but that phrase magnanimous is actually a better translation, as I understand, of ninji, which is the Tibetan word for compassion, which isn't literally translated as compassion. That's not a full translation. It's better translated apparently as great-hearted or open-heartedness, great-heartedness or open-heartedness. So it's this kind of magnanimousness, right? And again, this would be in terms of generosity of the mind. It would be interpreting things through the most, kinder lens. It's like being kind. It's like, okay, that person's having a bad day. I'm just going to let it wash over me. But also in terms of our own self-talk and the way we treat ourselves, we're often our own worst critics, right? So kind self-talk. So if you do something that you're ashamed of or embarrassed of, or you're upset with yourself about, giving yourself that kind of benefit of the doubt and that kind of understanding. So there's this whole kind of spectrum. And of course, Buddhism is about the middle way, and I expect that it's a wise position to take. So interesting question, right? Are you on the side of not being selfish enough? Do you need to, are you a people pleaser, like impulsively pleasing people and putting your knees down and being like a yes man or a yes woman, in a way that just ultimately other people pay for anyway? Because if we give out of an energy which isn't pure, it's likely that people are going to pay for our generosity, right? Because it wasn't coming from that pure place. So are you on that side where you're a people pleaser and you just ultimately it's not going to be for everyone's highest good because you're going to burn out or they're going to pay for it in some unexpected way downstream? Or the possibility of moving towards loosening the hold on ourselves and becoming more interested in other people's struggles, becoming more compassionate, kinder, generous, less selfish in that sense, but in a very kind of natural, positive, organic way that isn't a kind of moral tightening imposition upon ourselves. So it's like an opening. So I think that's what I want to say on that, really. So you got selfishness as a virtue and selfishness as a vice. And depending on the context, depending on where you're at, depending on the situation, it could be either or neither or both or whatever. It's just something that I think we often have these kind of one-stop thinking interpretations of phenomena. And it's like often there's, I think, a few more layers to dig down to find a kind of more full truth of the matter. So I think that's pretty much everything I want to say on selfishness for today. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.